Georgia, 1839. The summer heat clung heavy to the swamps, thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting magnolia blossoms. Whitlock Manor stood tall at the edge of a sprawling cotton plantation, its white columns cracked, its shutters sighing in the humid wind. The townsfolk whispered about the widow who lived there, Lady Margaret Whitlock, wealthy, imposing, and strange. After her husband's sudden death, she ruled the plantation with a cold iron grip. But it wasn't her power or her riches that fueled the rumors. It was what she did when the sun went down. Every evening, lanterns glowed in the rear wing of the house. Servants claimed to hear water sloshing, laughter that was not quite human, and moans that carried through the wooden halls. They said Lady Margaret stripped herself bare and stepped into her marble bathing pool, summoning chosen men from among her slaves to join her. To some, it was sin. To others, witchcraft. But to the lady, it was ritual. She believed the waters of her bath could preserve her beauty, keep her skin untouched by time, so long as she mixed her flesh with theirs. One young girl, Clara, who worked as a chambermaid, had seen it with her own eyes. She dared not speak of it loudly, but the image of Margaret's pale form, surrounded by dark, trembling bodies, haunted her dreams. The lady's eyes burned like embers in the candlelight, and her voice whispered promises no Christian tongue should utter. And yet, each man she chose never lasted long. By the next morning they would vanish, sold off, some said. Others swore they were buried in the swamp behind the manor, their bodies pale and drained. But Margaret Whitlock smiled on, her skin radiant, her beauty unyielding as if time itself obeyed her. And as autumn crept closer, the townsfolk feared what she would demand next, for the Lady of Whitlock Manor was never satisfied. In the slave quarters, whispers spread like fire through dry straw. The lady had chosen again. Her maids had already carried buckets of rose water to the marble pool, and candles were lit long before dusk. The men knew what it meant. One of them would be taken. Old Samuel, his back bent from decades in the fields, spat into the dirt when the name was spoken. God help the one she points her finger at tonight. Ain't no comin' back from her bath. The younger slaves sat silent, fear painted across their faces. They had all seen men disappear, healthy, strong men who were never seen again after the lady called them. None dared question where they went, for Margaret's eyes were sharp as knives, and her temper had ended more lives than the lash. Clara, the chambermaid, crept into the quarters late that evening, her face pale. "It's Nathaniel," she whispered. A collective gasp followed. Nathaniel was tall, broad-shouldered, and barely 20. He had been strong enough to pick nearly twice the cotton of other men, and many in the quarters depended on his endurance to ease their load. "He's marked," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I saw her touch his arm at supper. Tomorrow he won't be here." The men lowered their heads. The women prayed silently. Nathaniel himself said nothing. His eyes betrayed no fear, only a strange resignation, as though he had already accepted his fate. When the horn sounded at dusk, 2 of the lady's guards came for him. Nathaniel stood, squared his shoulders, and followed without protest. The quarters fell into silence. That night, as the bathhouse glowed with candlelight, Clara dared to creep close. Through the cracked shutters, she glimpsed the lady in the water, her pale body glistening. She beckoned Nathaniel forward. What Clara saw next turned her stomach cold, because the lady's shadow cast on the wall did not match her form. It was longer, twisted, and monstrous. And as Nathaniel stepped into the bath, the candles flickered as if choked by unseen breath. The bathhouse was a cathedral of shadows. High stone walls trapped the heat and the thick scent of rose water, while dozens of candles painted the air with trembling orange light. The marble pool in the center rippled as Lady Margaret stepped forward, the silk robe sliding from her shoulders with a deliberate grace. Nathaniel stood frozen at the edge. His chest rose and fell, sweat glistening on his dark skin, but his face betrayed nothing. He knew every eye in the manor was upon him, even if hidden behind shutters or lurking in corners like Clara. To disobey the lady meant death, swift and merciless. To obey meant something far worse. Margaret's voice was soft, melodic, but carried a weight that made the air heavy. "Come to me, Nathaniel." Her fingers skimmed the surface of the water, and it shimmered unnaturally, as though stirred by something unseen beneath. Nathaniel stepped in. The water was too warm, almost burning, as it licked up his legs, then his chest. His body tensed, but he did not speak. The lady moved closer, her pale hands trailing, across his shoulders, his chest, lingering far too long. Her touch was cold, unnaturally so, though the water steamed around them. From her lips spilled words not of English nor any tongue Nathaniel knew. A chant, low and guttural, that echoed off the walls like the groan of the swamp itself. The candles flickered violently. The scent of roses thickened until it choked. Clara pressed her eye to the shutter's crack, trembling. She could see Margaret's face, eyes rolled back, lips moving faster and faster. Nathaniel's body began to tremble, not from fear, but as though his very strength was being pulled from him. The muscles in his arms slackened, his breath grew shallow. The water darkened. Red swirled through the pool, faint at first, then stronger, until it looked as though the marble tub bled from its very seams. Clara stifled a cry. Margaret leaned in, her mouth brushing Nathaniel's ear. "Your body, your soul, your life, all belong to me." Nathaniel gasped as though the air had been stolen from his chest. His eyes fluttered, his body collapsing against her. And yet, Margaret stood taller, her skin flushed, glowing faintly in the candlelight, as if she had drunk from the fountain of youth itself. Clara stumbled back from the shutters, her heart pounding. She ran into the night, but the sound of Margaret's chant followed her, seeping into the trees, the fields, the swamp itself. For the first time, Clara understood the truth. Margaret was not just bathing with the slaves, she was feeding. Morning came heavy with mist. The fields were quiet, more so than usual. Men bent over their rows of cotton, hands trembling with every pull. The women stirred the pots in silence. Children did not laugh. Everyone knew what had happened the night before. But Nathaniel was gone. His sleeping mat in the quarters lay empty, his few belongings, an old cloth, a carved piece of wood, still there. No guard had led him back. No wagon had taken him away. The lady had swallowed him whole, as she had the others. Old Samuel muttered a prayer under his breath. "Every man she takes to death. Ain't no body left for burying." Clara could not shake the images from her mind. Nathaniel's strength had bled out into the bath, his chest sinking, while Margaret's pale form seemed to glow brighter. That glow still burned in her memory, seared into her eyes. At supper, Lady Margaret appeared before the household. She looked different, her cheeks fuller, her skin smooth like polished ivory, her eyes sharp and alive. Even her voice had a strange vitality, dripping with confidence. "Order will remain," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the slaves who dared not meet her eyes. "Those who serve me well will be rewarded. Those who fail me—" She paused, her lips curling into a smile that revealed just enough teeth. "Will be taken." The words settled in the room like a curse. No one spoke. Not even the guards shifted. That night Clara crept to the swamp's edge, guided by fear and curiosity. She had to know. She had to see for herself what became of the men. The air was thick with mosquitoes, the mud sucking at her bare feet. She followed the lantern light of the ladies' guards, who carried something heavy wrapped in cloth. They trudged deeper into the bog, to a clearing where the ground was black and wet. One guard dug with a spade, the other dumped the cloth bundle into the muck. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Through the shifting fabric she saw an arm, thin, lifeless, drained of muscle. Nathaniel. But when the guards left, Clara swore she saw the swamp move. The bundle sank quickly, too quickly, as though hungry earth pulled it under. The water rippled, bubbles rising, then silence. She fled, the image burning in her mind. The lady was not just bathing in blood. She was feeding the swamp, binding it to her. And now Clara knew. Whitlock Manor itself was alive, and Margaret was its queen. Days passed, but the plantation did not recover from Nathaniel's absence. The cotton lay heavier, the work slower. Men labored with hollow eyes, while women clutched their children tighter than before. Even the air seemed heavier, as though the swamp itself pressed down on every chest. At night, strange sounds carried from the trees, low groans, wet sloshing noises, whispers that travelled on the mist. Old Samuel warned the others, "The swamp done taken his soul. Ain't no rest for the dead when the lady feeds it." Clara tried to dismiss his words, but she could not. Every evening when she scrubbed the lady's chambers or lit her candles, she noticed the unnatural glow of Margaret's skin, the way her veins pulsed faintly with a light beneath. She looked younger, sharper, stronger, like a woman reborn. But Clara wasn't the only one who noticed. Father Harlan, the town preacher, arrived one humid afternoon under the guise of checking on the enslaved. His eyes lingered too long on Margaret. At supper he said, "It is God's miracle that grief has not withered you, Lady Whitlock, after your husband's passing. Bear de meso." Margaret's smile was slow, knowing, "I have found other ways to keep despair at bay, Father." That night, Clara overheard the guards whispering outside the quarters. They spoke of how the swamp had begun to change, fish floating belly up, trees rotting faster, frogs with strange white eyes staring from the mud. One of them muttered, "She's feeding it too much, even the earth's groaning." And then came the new selection. Margaret announced it during the evening meal. "Tomorrow I will bathe again, and I will choose." Her eyes scanned the men like knives across flesh. They froze, not daring to breathe. Finally her gaze settled on Elijah, a wiry man with clever hands and a quick tongue. Clara saw Elijah's shoulders stiffen, his jaw clench, but he bowed his head in silence. When night fell, Clara dreamed of Nathaniel's drained body sinking into the swamp. But in her dream, his eyes opened, milky white, lips whispering words she could not hear. The swamp pulled him under again, and the last thing she saw was his arm reaching, not for help, but beckoning her closer. She woke with a scream, sweat soaking her dress. The swamp was hungry, and Margaret was feeding it. The evening came heavy with thunder. Clouds pressed low, swallowing the last of the sun. The air was thick, charged, as though the heavens themselves knew what was about to happen within Whitlock Manor's walls. Elijah walked in silence as the guards led him toward the bathhouse. His steps were steady, but his jaw tightened with each one. The other slaves had gathered near the quarters, watching him pass. Some bowed their heads, others made the sign of the cross with trembling hands. Old Samuel whispered, "Don't look back, boy. Don't let her see fear." Inside the bathhouse, candles flickered against the marble walls, and the scent of roses once again suffocated the air. Lady Margaret stood waiting, her robe slipping off her shoulders like she was unveiling a holy relic. Her eyes glowed with unnatural brightness, hungry and expectant. "Elijah," she purred, her voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber, "step into my waters." Elijah hesitated only a moment. Then he stepped into the pool. The water licked at his skin like tongues of fire. He felt his strength falter instantly, as if the bath itself was alive, draining him. Margaret's hand touched his chest. Her fingers trailed over his heart, and with each word of her chant, he felt his pulse weakening. But Elijah was not like Nathaniel. His cleverness had carried him through lashes, hunger, and cruelty. He had expected this fate, and in his palm, hidden tightly, was a shard of glass he'd stolen from the laundry shed. As Margaret drew closer, pressing her lips near his ear, whispering her ancient words, Elijah struck. He drove the shard deep into her shoulder. The lady shrieked, a sound that rattled the windows and shook the candles. Black liquid, not blood, spilled from her wound, thick and reeking of iron and rot. The water writhed as though alive, slapping against the marble like waves in a storm. Elijah tried to scramble away, but her strength was monstrous. She seized him with one hand, lifting him as though he weighed nothing, her wound hissing as the swamp's breath seeped from it. "You dare," she snarled, her voice layered, not one but many, like a chorus of shadows. "You dare defy me." The glass fell from his hand. His body convulsed, strength pouring out of him faster than water down a drain. Margaret forced him under, the red tide rising as his screams turned to bubbles. Outside, Clara had pressed herself against the shutters again, horror freezing her in place. But as Elijah's body disappeared beneath the crimson water, she saw something new. The swamp's shadow on the wall didn't just belong to Margaret anymore. There were others now, dozens, maybe hundreds, shapes of men writhing, clawing, trapped in the reflection of the bath, and one of them looked straight at Clara. Clara stumbled back from the shutters, her breath sharp in her throat. She had seen it too clearly to doubt. Those were men's faces in the shadowed water, pale and warped, mouths opening in silent screams. Nathaniel's eyes had been there, now Elijah's too, and behind them, countless others, stretching back God knows how long. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs carried her the wrong way, toward the swamp. The trees loomed taller at night, their branches twisted like blackened claws. The air reeked of mud and stagnant water. Fireflies blinked weakly, but their glow seemed smothered by the mist rolling in waves across the ground. Clara followed the half-rotted path until she reached the clearing where she had seen the guards bury Nathaniel. The ground there was wrong. The soil pulsed as if it breathed. A faint red seeped through the muck, glowing faintly like embers in ash. Clara knelt, pressing her trembling hand to the mud. It was warm, too warm. And then the whispers began, not carried by wind, but rising from the earth itself. Dozens of voices, layered, begging, weeping, moaning. She recognized one instantly. Nathaniel's. "Help us!" Her body went cold. She stumbled backward, but the muck seemed to reach for her feet. In the flicker of lantern light, she saw a pale hand push tall through the soil. Then another. Fingers clawed upward, grasping, desperate. Clara fled, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear her own footsteps. The whispers chased her all the way back to the quarters, clinging to her ears even after she slammed the door shut. Inside, the others sat in silence. The air was heavy, thick with dread. When Clara finally found her voice, she whispered, "She's feeding the swamp, and the swamp. It's alive." Old Samuel nodded grimly, his eyes clouded but knowing fixed on her. "Child, that woman made a bargain long before you was born. Every bath, every body, she ain't just bathing, she's giving herself to the earth, and the earth's giving back." "What kind of bargain?" Clara asked, her voice small. Samuel spat into the dirt, "One that'll end us all if it ain't stopped." But before Clara could ask more, the horn sounded from the manor. The lady was calling again, and this time she demanded more than one man. The horn echoed through the cotton fields like a death knell. Its sound was deeper than usual, stretched and cruel, and it silenced every voice in the quarters. The slaves froze where they stood, tools dropping from their hands. Everyone knew what it meant. Clara's heart pounded. She had never heard the horn blown twice in 1 week. One man each month was already unbearable, but now the lady was hungry sooner. The guards appeared at the quarters before dusk. This time they did not call a name. Instead, their captain barked, "2 of you, the lady demands 2. A silence followed that could have swallowed the air itself. Men shifted uneasily, women pulled their children close. Finally, the guard's eyes landed on 2 figures, Joseph, a middle-aged man with a quiet strength, and Caleb, a boy barely 17. "No!" one of the older women cried, clutching Caleb's arm. "He's just a child!" Her wail was answered with the butt of a rifle across her face. Joseph bowed his head, silent, resigned. Caleb, trembling, tried to look brave, but his lips quivered. The guards dragged them toward the bathhouse, the sound of chains rattling in the thick summer air. Clara followed in secret again, her fear now a sickness in her chest. Through the shutters she watched as Margaret stood in her marble pool, her body gleaming in the candlelight. She spread her arms like a priestess before, in the altar. "Enter," she commanded. Joseph stepped forward without a word. Caleb hesitated, tears streaking his face, but the guards shoved him in. The water hissed as though it welcomed them. Margaret began to chant. The sound was deeper this time, layered with voices that did not belong to her. The water churned red faster than before, rising in spirals around the men. Joseph gasped, his skin paling, his body sinking as though the water itself drank him. Caleb screamed, a raw, piercing cry, as he clawed at the marble edge, but the lady's hand pressed him under with unnatural strength. The shadows on the wall writhed. Clara saw the swamp reflected there again, hands clawing, faces pressing against the water's surface, screaming without sound. And then she saw something worse. For a moment, Margaret's face twisted. It split, as though another face tried to push through her flesh. An older, monstrous visage, its mouth filled with jagged teeth. It grinned at the wall, and then was gone. When it was over, the water was still. Joseph and Caleb had vanished. Margaret stepped from the bath, glowing brighter than ever, her eyes shimmering like polished silver. Clara pressed her back against the shutters, gasping. The lady wasn't just growing younger, she was changing. The quarters were silent that night, but it was not the silence of rest. It was the silence of grief, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on every chest. Mothers clutched their sons tighter. Fathers stared blankly into the fire, knowing their strength meant nothing against the lady's horn. Clara lay awake on the dirt floor, her body trembling though the summer air was hot and sticky. She saw Caleb's face every time she closed her eyes, his desperate hands clawing at the marble, the bubbles escaping his mouth before the swamp swallowed him. She tried to pray, but her words turned to ash in her mouth. Outside, the cicadas screamed, and through the cracks in the walls, Clara swore she saw the swamp glowing faintly red in the distance, as if it were a beating heart. By dawn, the fields were restless. Whispers crept between rows of cotton. Some said the lady would not stop until every man was gone. Others swore she had made a pact with the devil himself. And then there were the old ones, like Samuel, who shook their heads and muttered that it was no devil at all, but something far older, something that had been waiting in the swamp long before Margaret drew her first breath. That evening, Clara found Samuel alone, staring at the horizon. His milky eyes shimmered in the twilight, and his voice was low when he spoke. "Child, you've seen it, ain't you? The way the water eats them, the way the ground breathes." Clara nodded, unable to speak. Samuel touched the dirt with his cracked hands. "Long ago, this land was never meant to hold us. Folks say the natives knew better. They called the swamp cursed, a place where the dead don't sleep. Margaret's family, they didn't listen. They made bargains, blood bargains, and now the land feeds." Clara's skin crawled. "Feeds on what?" Samuel's eyes met hers, and for a moment the years of pain in them cut her deeper than any blade. "On us." The horn blew again before dawn the next day. This time, panic erupted in the quarters. Men bolted for the tree line, women screamed, children wailed. The guards rode in like hunters, their whips cracking, their dogs baying. 2 men were dragged out, beaten bloody before being chained together. Clara couldn't stop herself. She ran behind them barefoot, her chest tight with every step. The swamp was louder now, hissing and groaning as if it sensed the feast. When the lady appeared at the bathhouse steps, her skin shone unnaturally pale, her eyes almost glowing silver in the torchlight. She welcomed the captives like honored guests, her voice honeyed and cruel. "Do not fear, your suffering will make me eternal." Clara's stomach churned as the men were lowered into the water. The swamp's reflection on the marble walls began to shimmer violently. She saw hundreds of faces writhing beneath the surface, screaming, pressing upward as if begging for release. The bath turned red faster this time. The lady's laughter echoed across the water, her voice blending with something deeper, an inhuman growl rising from the depths. The swamp itself seemed to breathe heavier, as though it was hungrier than ever, and in the mist outside the bathhouse, Clara thought she saw shapes forming, figures of men, their bodies dripping with mud and blood, walking slowly toward the quarters. They were not alive. They were not dead. They were something in between. Clara stumbled backward, her voice barely a whisper. "God help us. It's only beginning." The night after the ladies' bath, the quarters refused to sleep. Mothers kept their children awake, whispering prayers, rocking them gently even as their own tears fell. Men sat at the edges of their bunks, with clenched fists staring at the dirt floor, though every one of them knew their strength would mean nothing when the horn sounded again. But Clara couldn't sit still. The images haunted her, the shapes rising in the mist, dripping mud, moving like men but not men. She had to know if they were real, or if her fear had made phantoms out of shadows. So, with the moon low and swollen, she crept outside. The fields were empty, the cicadas strangely silent, the air smelled of iron and rot. Every step toward the swamp seemed to pull her deeper into silence, into darkness. Then she saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the trees, 5 of them, mud caked across their faces and torsos, their eyes pale and empty. One she recognized instantly, Joseph. His strong shoulders were hunched, his body slack, but his face was twisted, stretched, as if screaming forever beneath the mud. Next to him was Caleb, the boy, his eyes wide, mouth gaping, mud oozing from between his lips. They stared at her, motionless. And then, slowly, their heads tilted in unison. Clara's knees went weak. She wanted to run, but her feet rooted in the soil. The air thickened, pressing on her lungs. And then, from the trees behind them, she saw dozens more emerging. A procession of the dead, every one of them a man she had once known from the fields. They did not stumble like corpses. They moved with dreadful purpose, slow but steady, as if answering a call. And then she heard it, the lady's voice, not carried by wind, but rising from the swamp itself. A chant, low and guttural, words that weren't English, words that seemed older than the soil itself. The dead moved in rhythm with it, their limbs jerking slightly with each syllable. Clara staggered back, choking on her own breath. Her heart raced as the first of them stepped onto the dirt path leading straight toward the quarters. She knew she had to warn the others. She ran, branches whipping her face, her lungs burning as she stumbled back into the cabins. "They're coming," she cried. "The dead, Joseph, Caleb, they're walking here." At first, the others stared at her in disbelief, but then the dogs began to bark, howling wildly at the tree line. The sound of shuffling feet rose like a storm, and soon, through the cracks in the walls, every man, woman, and child saw them. The hollow-eyed figures trudging across the fields, mud dripping from their bodies. Panic broke. Children screamed, women prayed. Men grabbed whatever they could, a hoe, a rusted blade, a piece of wood. The quarters turned to chaos as the first of the dead reached the cabin doors, their pale hands pressing against the wood, and then, all at once, silence fell again. The lady herself appeared at the edge of the swamp, lantern in hand, her silver eyes gleaming. She raised one pale hand, and every corpse froze in place. "Return," she whispered. The dead obeyed. They turned as one, retreating back into the mist, back toward the swamp, until the fields were empty once more. But Clara knew it was only a warning. A display. The lady wasn't just feeding the swamp anymore, she was raising an army from it, and the swamp was changing with her. The next night, no one dared to sleep. Every creak of the wooden cabins, every gust of wind through the cracks, made the people flinch. Mothers kept their children pressed to their chests. Men sat at the doors with makeshift weapons, hoes, axes, sharpened sticks. But even they knew these tools were nothing against the dead they had seen. Clara sat beside the fire, her eyes wide and unblinking. She couldn't forget Joseph's face or Caleb's empty stare. Their bodies had been taken, their souls trapped. But the lady, why had she shown them? Why had she let her army march and then called them back? Because she wanted them afraid, because fear itself was another form of feeding. Suddenly, a whisper slithered through the cabin. At first, Clara thought it was her imagination, but then others heard it too. A low hiss, not from outside, but from the earth beneath them. "Clara!" Her blood froze. The fire sputtered, dimming as if smothered by unseen hands. The dirt floor seemed to pulse, tiny cracks glowing faintly red. She scrambled back, her heart hammering. Then, a hand shot up through the ground, pale, bloated, slick with mud, fingers spread wide, reaching. Another hand followed. The floor split open as a figure began to rise, its face slick, mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The cabin erupted in screams. Men slammed their makeshift weapons down on the figure, splintering wood and spraying mud, but more hands burst through the floor. At least 3 bodies clawed their way upward, hissing like serpents, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The children cried out, the mothers dragged them back, and Samuel shouted above the chaos, "They can't be killed, they're hers now." The door burst open. Guards stormed in, rifles raised, but when they fired, the bullets only shredded mud and water. The corpses staggered but kept moving, clawing at anyone close enough. One guard screamed as a muddy hand gripped his face and pulled him straight into the dirt, vanishing beneath the floor as though the earth had swallowed him whole. Clara grabbed Samuel's arm. "We can't fight them. Where do we run?" Samuel's voice shook. "The church, the old one by the river. If anything holy's left on this land, it'll be there." Through the chaos, Clara pulled children by the hand, dragging them toward the door. The night outside was worse, shadows shifting in the fields, corpses crawling out of the earth like worms after rain. Some walked, some dragged themselves with broken limbs, all moving toward the cabins. The lady stood at a distance, her pale gown glowing in the moonlight, her silver eyes unblinking. She lifted her hand again, and every corpse turned its head toward Clara. The whisper came back, curling in her mind like smoke. "You will be mine." Clara stumbled, clutching the cross around her neck with trembling fingers, and for the first time she prayed not just for mercy. She prayed for fire, for something strong enough to burn this curse from the earth. Behind her, the cabins burned as the dead tore them apart. Ahead of her, the swamp hissed, glowing red in the dark. Clara's bare feet slapped against the dirt as she pulled two children behind her, Samuel hobbling close behind with his walking stick. The air was thick with smoke from the burning cabins, screams echoing in the fields as the dead ripped through wood and flesh alike. The path to the river was narrow, overgrown, and long abandoned. Few dared to tread it anymore. The old church had been boarded up years ago, the white paint peeled to grey, its bells silent since before Clara was born. But Samuel swore it held power, and power was the only chance they had. The group stumbled through the fields. Behind them, the lady's laughter carried across the smoke, low, lilting, almost sweet. Every few seconds, Clara heard the shuffle of mud-soaked feet drawing closer. She dared not look back. "Keep moving," Samuel hissed, gripping her arm when she slowed. His blind eyes were wide, but his steps were sure, as if he were guided by something stronger than sight. Branches tore at Clara's arms as they entered the forest. The children whimpered, clutching her hands so tightly her knuckles burned. Every snap of a twig made her heart leap. Shadows moved in the trees, too tall, too crooked to be branches. Then came the smell, rot, thick and suffocating, like bodies left too long in the summer sun. The swamp's breath was reaching them, pushing through the woods, and with it came the whispers. "Clara, Clara." She bit her lip until it bled, dragging the children faster. At last, through the trees, the church appeared. Its steeple leaned like a broken finger, its doors crooked and covered in moss. But the cross still clung stubbornly to the roof, blackened but standing. Clara almost sobbed with relief. They rushed to the doors. Samuel pressed his palms against the wood and whispered a prayer under his breath. The door creaked open, revealing the rotted interior. Pews lay broken, dust thick in the air, but the altar remained. A stone cross stood crooked but unbroken at its center. They hurried inside and slammed the doors shut. The children huddled near the altar, whimpering, while Samuel laid his hand on the stone cross. For the first time that night he smiled faintly. "There is still light here," he whispered. But then, thud. The doors shuddered. Another thud, louder. Mud-slick fingers began to slip through the cracks, pushing at the wood. The walls groaned as though the entire building was being squeezed. Clara pressed her back against the door, her body trembling as she looked toward Samuel. "Will it hold?" she asked, desperate. Samuel's smile faded. "Only if we believe." And outside, dozens of hollow voices rose in unison, chanting the same guttural words the lady had spoken at the bath. The sound rattled the windows, made the air itself throb. The church was not safe. It was being tested. Clara held the children close, staring at the altar. If there was truly any holy power left, now was the moment it had to rise. There was nowhere left to hide. The pounding at the church doors grew louder, each strike rattling the rotting wood. Clara clutched the children tightly, her back pressed to the altar as Samuel spread his arms wide before the stone cross, chanting prayers through trembling lips. The whispers outside rose in unison, a chorus of the dead repeating the lady's chant. Each word throbbed through the walls, making the windows shiver in their frames. The smell of rot seeped in through the cracks, filling the sanctuary with the stench of decay. Then the first break came. Splinters flew inward as pale, mud-soaked hands punched through the wood. The children screamed, and Clara nearly did too, until she saw something strange. Where the hands touched the altar's light, they smoked, hissing like meat on fire. The corpses howled, pulling back, their guttural cries echoing like beasts in pain. Samuel's voice grew stronger. He pounded his staff against the floor, shouting words that no one else understood. The cracks in the dirt floor glowed faintly gold now, pushing back against the red glow of the swamp. The church groaned, but it held, for the moment. Suddenly the lady's laughter pierced the night, louder than the dead, sharper than the storm. The doors slammed once more, and this time the wood shattered. Figures poured in, dozens of corpses, their eyes pale, their mouths stretched too wide. They surged forward, clawing, hissing. Clara screamed, dragging the children behind the altar as the first of the dead rushed Samuel. He did not flinch. He raised his staff high, and the stone cross blazed with sudden light. The glow struck the nearest corpse, and it burst apart in a spray of mud and ash. The others recoiled, shrieking, but they did not stop. They swarmed like locusts, crawling along the walls, across the ceiling, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they sought a way around the light. Clara grabbed a broken piece of pew, swinging wildly as one corpse lunged at her. The wood smashed through its face, splitting it in two, but instead of falling, the creature only hissed and clawed again. She cried out, striking harder until Samuel's staff slammed between them and the thing dissolved into ash. The church rang with screams, prayers, and the lady's chant outside. Clara could see her through the shattered door now, Margaret standing tall in her white gown, her silver eyes glowing like twin moons. She raised her hand slowly, and with it, the corpses stopped. They froze, their heads turning in unison toward Clara. The lady smiled. "Bring her." The dead moved again, this time with a single purpose. Every claw, every pale hand reaching for Clara. The cross's light slowed them, burned them, but still they pressed closer, their numbers endless. Clara clutched the children, her heart hammering as Samuel shouted, his voice breaking, "Clara, run!" Clara's chest heaved as the dead swarmed the church. Samuel's prayers thundered against their guttural chanting, the cross glowing brighter with every word. But still the creatures pushed forward, their bodies blistering under the holy light yet refusing to fall. The lady stepped through the shattered doorway, her pale gown untouched by smoke or blood. Her silver eyes gleamed, and at her presence the corpses paused, bowing their heads as though a queen had entered her court. "Clara," she said softly, her voice carrying like silk across the chaos, "you belong to me." Clara clutched the children tighter, shaking her head. "Never." The lady smiled, and the corpses moved again. They surged forward, clawing at the altar, hissing as Samuel thrust his staff into their ranks. Bursts of light scorched them into ash, but for every one destroyed, 3 more pressed closer. Then the lady raised her hand. The stone cross trembled, its glow faltering as though smothered by her will. Samuel staggered, blood trickling from his nose as he cried out, "Resist her, child. She feeds on your fear. Don't give it to her." But Clara's body shook uncontrollably. The lady's silver gaze pierced her mind, flooding her with images. Caleb drowning, Joseph screaming, the mud pulling them down forever. Her knees buckled, the children's cries fading into a dull roar in her ears. Margaret stepped closer, her voice honey-sweet, terrible. "One touch, Clara. One step into my waters, and I will end their suffering. Come willingly, and I will let these little ones live." The children sobbed, clinging to Clara's dress. Samuel bellowed another prayer, his voice breaking, but the corpses forced him back, dragging him to the ground. Clara's heart raced. She looked at Samuel, at the terrified children, at the lady standing tall like a goddess in the ruined church. And then something stirred in her chest. Not fear, not despair, but anger. The cross flickered brighter. The lady's smile faltered. Clara rose slowly to her feet, her trembling hands clenched into fists. "You will not have me!" The corpses hissed and lunged, the lady's silver eyes narrowed, and the church itself shook as if the earth beneath it had chosen sides. The floor cracked open beneath Clara's feet, glowing veins of gold splitting through the dirt as if the earth itself bled light. The corpses shrieked, their twisted bodies writhing in pain, but the lady only stepped forward calmly, her silver eyes unblinking. Samuel's voice rose again, hoarse and ragged, but Clara barely heard him. A force pulsed within her chest, answering the lady's gaze. She felt as though two hands were pulling her soul in opposite directions, one toward the swamp's black waters, the other toward the burning light beneath the cross. The lady lifted her hand, and spectral chains of silver shot through the air, wrapping around Clara's arms and throat. They burned cold, searing her skin like ice and fire at once. The children screamed, pulling at her dress, but the chains yanked her forward, dragging her step by step toward Margaret. "See how she bends," the lady whispered. "See how she comes home." Clara's knees buckled as the chains pulled. Tighter. Her breath hitched, vision darkening. For a moment she almost gave in. The promise of silence, of release, shimmered before her. No more screams, no more loss, no more fear. But then Joseph's tiny voice broke through. "Don't let her take you, Clara. Please don't go." The words tore through her fog. Clara's eyes snapped open. Her anger returned, hot, blinding, unstoppable. The gold veins on the floor blazed brighter, shooting up the altar, racing across the ceiling like fire in dry grass. The chains rattled, cracked, and then shattered. The lady's silver eyes widened. "No." Clara stood tall, her hair whipping around her face in the unnatural wind. Her voice was raw but steady. "You will not touch them, and you will not touch me." The corpses recoiled, their forms crumbling into ash wherever the golden light struck. Samuel, bloodied but unbroken, thrust his staff into the ground, shouting words Clara did not understand, but somehow felt inside her bones. The church blazed with holy fire. The lady screamed, a piercing, inhuman sound that rattled the rafters. Her white gown burned with streaks of shadow, her form flickering as if torn between this world and another. Yet even as her skin cracked with light, she reached for Clara with one last desperate hand. "Child, you are mine." Clara seized the cross from the altar, its stone now glowing like molten gold, and raised it high. The light burst outward, swallowing the church in brilliance. When it cleared, the corpses were gone. Only the scent of smoke and the echo of the lady's scream lingered. Clara stood trembling in the silence, the cross heavy in her hands, the children clinging to her legs. Samuel knelt against the wall, coughing blood, but alive. Outside, the swamp was silent, too silent. Because though the lady had been broken, Clara felt it deep in her chest. This was not the end. Something darker had only just been awakened. The swamp held its breath. Not a frog croaked, not a breeze stirred the cypress trees. The stillness pressed against Clara's skin, heavier than the chains had ever been. She clutched the glowing cross, its heat searing her palms, and dared not move. Samuel staggered forward, leaning on his staff, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "She's wounded, but not gone," he rasped. "The swamp, it shelters her. We've only cut at her shadow." Clara looked down at the children. Joseph's wide eyes reflected the faint gold light, while Sarah buried her face in Clara's skirts, trembling. They had survived the night, but for how long? From the shattered windows came the scent of water, thick with rot. Clara shivered. In that stench was something alive, something watching. She thought she saw ripples across the swamp's surface, though no stone had been thrown. "Samuel," she whispered, "what if she comes again?" He lifted his gaze toward the darkness beyond the church door. His voice was grim but steady. "Then we'll face her with what we have left. But child, listen to me. Her power is not only in the swamp. It lives in the blood of this land, in the cruelty of those who built it. As long as pain lingers here, she will never truly die." The words sank into Clara's chest, colder than the swamp's black waters. Was she bound not only by Margaret's will, but by the sins of the plantation itself? The silence broke. A splash echoed outside, deliberate, heavy, as though a body had stepped into the water. Then another, then dozens. The sound spread, rippling in every direction, as if unseen feet walked across the swamp. The children screamed. Clara raised the cross instinctively, its glow flaring brighter. The golden veins in the church floor pulsed again, answering the noise. And then came the voice, soft, female, singing. A lullaby, the same lullaby Clara remembered her mother humming before the fever took her. The same voice she had heard on the nights she thought she dreamt of Margaret standing at her bedside. The lady's voice. Samuel fell to his knees, clutching his ears. The children wailed. Clara bit her lip until it bled, forcing herself not to listen, not to surrender. Yet part of her ached. The voice was beautiful, promising comfort, promising an end to sorrow. But beneath the sweetness, Clara heard something else. Rage. The lady was calling her. And this time the swamp itself seemed to sing with her. Clara gripped the cross tighter, her hands blistering. The fight was far from over. The sound of the lullaby grew stronger, weaving itself through the broken church walls like smoke. Clara pressed the children tighter against her, her knuckles white around the cross. She wanted to block her ears, to silence the melody, but some part of her knew it wasn't meant only to be heard. It was meant to be felt. Each step they took left black water behind, soaking the church like a spreading stain. Margaret's voice rang out, sharp and triumphant. "See them, Clara? They are mine. Bound by their suffering, bound by their deaths. They sing my song even in silence. They are the choir of my eternity." The ghosts moaned as one, a sound that rattled the air and made Joseph collapse in tears. Sarah clutched Clara's skirt, but would not raise her head, too afraid to look. Samuel tried to crawl toward the spirits, his voice breaking. No, no, these were men, brothers, fathers, not slaves to you, not forever. His body shook violently, and he slumped to the floor, breath shallow. Clara's grip on the cross faltered, not from weakness, but from pity. She could see them clearer now, their faces, their pain. Some still bore welts across their backs, others the twisted marks of drowning. These were not monsters. They were victims, crying for release. The lady extended her arms, the swamp dripping from her fingers like ink. "Kneel, Clara. Join them. It is your blood that feeds their chains. Resist no more." The chains of the spirits rattled violently, as though drawn toward Clara. One ghost fell at her feet, its mouth opening in a silent scream, black water pouring from its lungs. Another reached for her hand, not to harm, but to beg. Clara felt her resolve shift. They weren't attacking. They were pleading. With trembling strength, she raised the cross over her head. Its golden light pulsed brighter, spreading through the church. "You are not hers," Clara cried. "You are not her choir. You are men, stolen from your lives, bound by her wickedness. I call you free." The light burst outward, striking the nearest spirit. Its hollow eyes flared with gold before its body dissolved into mist, its chains shattering like glass. The others staggered back, groaning as though torn between two masters. Margaret shrieked, her scream splitting the air. "No, they are mine!" Her voice shook the walls, and the swamp surged higher, waves crashing into the church. The lady's shadow stretched long across the walls, twisting, trying to choke out the golden glow. Clara's arms ached, but she held the cross higher, the fire burning into her flesh. The ghosts crowded closer, chains clinking, their eyes flickering between silver and gold. One by one, they began to turn their gaze away from the lady, and Margaret's snarl twisted into something far more dangerous: fear. The church groaned as though it would split in half. The swamp water rose to the knees, cold and thick, pulling at Clara's legs with every step she took. The freed spirits shimmered like mist around her, their chains falling in shards that sank beneath the water. For each soul that slipped free, the lady's scream grew louder. Margaret's silver eyes blazed like twin fires. "Ungrateful wretches!" she howled, her voice echoing across the swamp and sky alike. "You were mine in life, you will be mine in death." Her arms flung wide, and the water obeyed. It surged like a living beast, striking the walls, tearing down crucifixes, flooding the altar. The children clung to Clara's skirt, sobbing as the pews floated and slammed into one another like wreckage in a storm. Clara's arms trembled as she raised the cross higher. Her voice cracked but did not falter. "You cannot bind them any longer, lady. They will not sing your song again." The spirits moaned louder, a chorus rising not in fear but in resistance. Their golden flickers burned brighter, illuminating the dark water. But Margaret was not finished. She stepped into the church. Water slid off her white gown, which clung to her body like a second skin. Her long hair writhed like black serpents, dripping poison into the water. As she advanced, shadows coiled around her feet, stretching across the flooded floor, seeking to ensnare Clara. "Do you not see?" Margaret's voice softened, becoming that deadly lullaby again. "It is useless. The swamp is eternal, and so am I. Your light will burn out, your arms will fail, and when you fall, child, you will join them, all of you." Her hand shot forward and the shadows leapt, wrapping around Clara's wrists and throat. The cross slipped for a heartbeat, its light faltering. Clara gagged, struggling against the pull as icy black tendrils tried to drag her under. The spirits cried out as one, their voices shaking the rafters. A few broke free completely, their chains shattering in bursts of gold, but others were seized again, dragged back by Margaret's fury. The swamp bubbled violently, and monstrous shapes began to rise beneath its surface. Clara forced a breath through her tightening throat, her vision dimming. The cross seared into her palms, branding her skin, but she clung to it like life itself. "Not yours," she croaked, her body trembling. The golden veins in the church floor blazed brighter, spreading up the walls, into the roof. For the first time, Margaret staggered, shielding her eyes from the radiance. Her beautiful face twisted, her snarl becoming almost animal. "You dare blind me in my own swamp?" she shrieked. And then, in a voice that shook both the living and the dead, Margaret declared, "Then you will drown with me." Writing Chapter 21, Clash of Light and Shadow. The church became a battlefield of forces unseen. The golden veins running through the floor glowed like molten rivers, while the swamp water boiled black, vomiting shadows that slithered toward Clara. Margaret surged forward, her body unnaturally tall, her limbs lengthening with each step, her silver eyes fixed on Clara with pure malice. "You will drown, girl, and the swamp will carry your bones as it carries theirs." Clara planted her feet in the water, even as it pulled and sucked at her ankles. Her voice shook, but her grip on the cross was iron. "I will not be your slave, and neither will they." With a scream that rattled the rafters, Margaret lunged. Her shadowy tendrils lashed out, slamming against Clara's chest and knocking her back into the water. The children screamed. The cross nearly slipped from Clara's hands, plunging into the black current, but at the last moment she caught it, its glow bursting upward like lightning. The spirits rallied at the light. One by one they tore against their spectral chains, crying out in unison. Golden sparks burst from their bodies, mingling in the air, weaving into Clara's light. For the first time, Clara felt them not as victims, but as allies, an army rising to resist the lady. Margaret shrieked. She raised both arms, and the swamp surged like a tidal wave, smashing against the church walls. Windows shattered, timbers groaned, the entire building leaning as though about to collapse into the mire. Clara stumbled to her knees, coughing, but raised the cross high above her head. The golden veins pulsed stronger, coursing up her arms like fire. She cried out, not in prayer but in raw defiance, "Be free!" The spirits answered. Their hollow voices turned into a roar, their golden light bursting outward, colliding with the lady's shadow. The church blazed, half drowned in gold and black, the clash so fierce it felt like heaven and hell colliding. Margaret staggered for the first time, her form flickering, her shadow peeling away like smoke. Yet her face twisted with rage, and she lunged again, this time aiming directly for Clara's throat. The cross seared white-hot, almost burning Clara's flesh as it blazed brighter than ever before. The swamp screamed with her. The battle for the souls and Clara's life had begun in full. Writing Chapter 22. The Lady Unveiled. The swamp howled with rage. Outside the broken church walls, trees bent as though pressed by invisible hands, their branches clawing the night sky. The golden veins in the floor pulsed faster, brighter, until they glowed like rivers of molten light. Margaret's form rippled, her pale flesh stretched unnaturally, her white gown tearing as shadows poured from her body like smoke. Her beauty melted away, revealing the horror beneath. A creature half woman, half swamp, her face split with too many teeth, her eyes silver pools that dripped like mercury. Her fingers lengthened into claws, black and dripping. The children screamed. Joseph buried his face in Clara's skirt, but Sarah, wide-eyed and trembling, whispered, She's not human." "No," Clara said through gritted teeth, her voice raw but steady. "She never was." The lady lunged, her monstrous arms tearing through pews like paper. Clara raised the cross, its searing white light colliding with the shadow. The clash exploded, flinging both women backward. The lady into the flooded altar, Clara against the cracked wall. Her breath was knocked from her lungs, but she refused to let go of the cross. Margaret rose again, her monstrous form swelling, taller than the rafters. "You think you wield light?" she hissed, her voice layered with 100 tones. "I was the light once. They worshipped me, obeyed me, feared me. And now you," she snarled, pointing one claw at Clara, "a girl of mud and chains, dare to do for me?" The shadows around her coalesced into forms, arms, faces, half-formed bodies reaching, screaming, trying to pull Clara down. Clara staggered, the swamp water dragging her waist-deep, but the spirits rallied around her. Their golden flickers swirled together, forming a barrier between her and the shadows. "Not hers!" Clara screamed, her voice cracking. "You belong to no one!" The spirits roared with her, their sound a wave of thunder. More chains shattered, more faces lifted, their hollow eyes glowing bright. For each soul that broke free, Margaret shrieked louder, her monstrous body writhing as though pieces of herself were being ripped away. The church ceiling cracked, beams splitting as if heaven itself bore witness. Margaret lunged again, faster, her claws reaching for Clara's heart. Clara lifted the cross with both hands, and light poured from it like a river, colliding with the lady's shadow in a storm of black and gold. The swamp itself screamed, the night shook, and for the first time Margaret's voice broke not with rage, but with terror. The storm inside the church reached its peak. Lightning split the sky above, illuminating the swamp in violent flashes. Each bolt revealed Margaret's monstrous form, her dripping claws, her face torn between rage and fear. Clara stood soaked and trembling but unyielding. The cross blazed so brightly now that it scorched her palms, her skin blistered, but she held on. Every time the light struck, another spirit broke free, their chains exploding into shards of gold that dissolved into the air. The lady howled, staggering under the loss. "Stop!" she bellowed. "They are mine! Their blood, their suffering, their bones, they belong to me!" "No," Clara shouted, her voice echoing above the roar of the swamp. "They belong to themselves. Their pain ends tonight." The spirits surged, emboldened by her defiance. Dozens, then hundreds of faces rose from the water. Men, women, children, all chained, all screaming. But as Clara raised the cross higher, its glow spread outward in a wave, striking each chain, each collar, each shackle. The sound was deafening, iron snapping, bonds breaking. Margaret's body convulsed, as though every broken chain tore through her own flesh. Her monstrous form began to split, her skin cracking, her silver eyes spilling streams of liquid light. She fell to her knees, clawing at the water. The swamp fought back. The black tide surged into the church, dragging pews, tearing at the foundation. The building groaned, ready to collapse. Yet the golden veins pulsed harder, brighter, spreading into the water itself. For the first time the swamp glowed, not with corruption, but with freedom, the freed. Spirits lifted their hollow eyes to Clara, their faces no longer twisted in agony, but calm, almost serene. They surrounded her, their bodies becoming light, streaming upward into the broken roof, toward the storm above. Margaret screamed, her voice splitting into dozens, then hundreds of tones, inhuman and furious. She staggered forward, her claws slashing through the air. "You cannot destroy me. I am the swamp. I am eternity." Clara's voice rang out, fierce, unafraid. "Then eternity ends tonight." She thrust the cross downward into the water. The golden light burst through the swamp like fire racing through oil. The church floor split, the swamp convulsed, and Margaret's monstrous scream turned into a shriek of pure terror. The lady's form split apart, collapsing into streams of black smoke that burned away in the golden fire. The chains were gone. The spirits were free. The swamp roared like a living beast, but its voice was breaking. The golden light seared through every crack of the church, flooding the water, the walls, the air itself. The freed spirits rose higher, their hollow eyes glowing bright, their chains gone forever. Margaret staggered in the flood of brilliance. Her monstrous body writhed, the silver in her eyes spilling down her cheeks like molten tears. Her claws raked the air, but every strike passed through nothing, meeting only the light. "No," she shrieked, her many voices splintering into chaos. "You cannot end me. I am the swamp. I am the blood. I am—" Her words cut short as her body split, cracks of gold running through her like lightning. She stumbled, clawing at her chest, her form collapsing inward. Clara's voice rang out, raw but unshaken. "You are nothing but a curse, and curses can be broken." The spirits answered with a cry that shook the heavens. A wave of golden light swept through them, joining into a single blazing column. It struck the lady, piercing her heart. Margaret screamed one final time. Her monstrous body shattered into black fragments that dissolved into the swamp water. Her shadow twisted and writhed, then burned away in the radiance, leaving only silence behind. The swamp calmed. The water, once black and writhing, stilled until it reflected the storm's fading light. The golden veins dimmed slowly, their work complete, leaving the church in ruin, but no longer corrupted. The spirits rose like fireflies into the night sky, their forms dissolving into pure light. And for the first time their cries were not of pain, but of release. Clara collapsed to her knees, the cross still glowing faintly in her blistered hands. Joseph and Sarah rushed to her, clinging to her arms, their sobs of terror replaced by relief. Samuel, weak but breathing, managed a trembling smile. "It's done," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "She's gone." But in the distance, beyond the calm swamp, thunder still rolled. The storm was not entirely gone. Somewhere, something lingered, and Clara knew the fight might not be finished. Not yet. And for the first time in generations, the swamp was silent. The swamp was still. No longer did it boil with shadows or whisper with chains. The church, broken and blackened, stood like the husk of something terrible left behind. For the first time in decades, the air tasted clean. Clara stood with Joseph, Sarah, and Samuel at the edge of the water. The dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft pink and gold. The storm had finally passed. "The land will heal now," Samuel said quietly, leaning on Joseph's shoulder for support. His voice was weak but certain. "The lady's grip is broken." Clara gazed out over the swamp, where the last shimmer of spirit light drifted into the heavens like dying embers. She felt the silence deep in her chest, a silence that was not empty but full of peace, of release, of lives finally set free. Sarah clutched her sister's hand. "We made it," she whispered. "We're alive." Clara managed a faint smile. Her hands still burned from holding the cross, her body ached, but her heart felt lighter than it had ever been. The curse was gone. They turned away from the ruins together, walking slowly toward the plantation path. The fields, once choked with rot, now seemed to breathe again. Birds sang cautiously in the distance, as if testing a world that had been silent too long. By the time the sun rose fully, the four of them had left the swamp behind. It would never again hold the power of the lady. Clara paused one last time and looked back. She whispered softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "Rest now, all of you." And with that, she walked on. The story of the plantation lady ended there, buried in the swamp's depths, remembered only by the silence of the trees and the freedom of the souls she once bound. The end.